It all began on a sweltering Tuesday morning when I stepped outside to inspect my ranch that had been in my family for generations. The air smelled of freshly tilled soil, and wild grass swayed gently under the early sunlight. I loved this place more than anything and had poured decades of blood, sweat, and tears into it. Yet that morning I was greeted not by peace, but by chaos and absurdity as a shiny black SUV screeched to a halt near my main gate, and out stormed none other than Karen Simmons, the so-called president of the local HOA, notorious in our county for petty complaints and tyrannical enforcement of rules no one had even agreed to. But today her glare was sharper, her heels clicked like gunshots on my stone pathway, and she waved a clipboard as if it were a weapon. I narrowed my eyes as she barked at me, claiming I was in violation of some new rule about fencing color, something that hadn't existed yesterday, something that somehow required me to repaint every barn on my 500-acre property in beige because apparently the HOA had decreed brown barns were offensive to the neighborhood aesthetic. I tried to reason with her, explaining calmly that this was my private ranch outside the city limits and that the HOA had zero jurisdiction here. But Karen ignored me and raised her voice louder in front of my neighbors who had gathered out of curiosity and amusement. She pulled out an eviction notice like she had just won the lottery and declared that unless I complied immediately, she would have me forcibly removed. I laughed so hard that I startled a couple of horses nearby. How could she be so deluded? She didn't know me at all, didn't realize that my name sat at the top of the HOA board, not just locally, but nationally. I'd spent years quietly acquiring enough influence to oversee hundreds of associations across the country. And today, it seemed she had unwittingly poked the wrong hornet's nest. And as I stepped closer, my shadow stretching over her petite frame, I could see her lips quiver slightly in uncertainty. My heart pounded not with fear, but with exhilaration, because I had already begun plotting a response that would make her rethink ever crossing me again. I started by casually mentioning that my oversight extended beyond our county, and that every HOA she belonged to reported up to my office, and my voice was calm, but the weight behind it undeniable. She froze her eyes, darting to the clipboard to check if it would somehow save her. I asked her if she understood the consequences of attempting to evict a property owner who actually controlled the regulatory network she had sworn to enforce. Suddenly, she looked like a rabbit caught in headlights, and her mouth opened as if to speak, but no words came out. She was calculating, I knew it, and I smiled inwardly because she had underestimated me, and underestimation was my favorite weapon. Then I continued, explaining that any attempt to escalate this matter would result in her own HOA being audited, every fine reversed, and her leadership revoked, not to mention a formal complaint filed with every HOA chapter from California to New York. And the thought of her trying to save face while I controlled the strings made my entire body hum with satisfaction. I could see her knees buckle slightly, and then I calmly invited her inside for a discussion over coffee. But it was a polite trap, because every move she made now would be logged and reported to higher boards as potential misconduct. My neighbors were now whispering and watching keenly, taking mental notes of how a tiny HOA tyrant could be so publicly humbled. And in that moment, I realized the story would spread like wildfire within our community. The satisfaction of knowing that my decades of work allowed me to defend not only my property, but my dignity was intoxicating. Karen, still flustered, clutched the clipboard as I began to walk around the ranch, showing her the fences, barns, and fields, each one perfectly maintained and clearly outside her jurisdiction, while explaining my history with HOA governance, and how every violation she tried to invent could be challenged legally at multiple levels. She nodded, but her nod lacked conviction. I asked her quietly if she had ever considered the national implications of her actions, and whether she wanted the next board meeting to involve a comprehensive review of her compliance records. Her eyes widened and her voice quivered as she mumbled something about miscommunication. I smiled inwardly, because miscommunication was exactly what I had counted on. It was the perfect word to disarm someone like her. Then I suggested that perhaps she should leave before things escalated, and she agreed, shakily retreating to her SUV. While muttering excuses under her breath, I watched her drive away with a smug satisfaction, but also with a spark of curiosity about what she would do next. And What foolishly ambitious plan she might attempt to regain control. Little did she know that her attempt to assert authority over me had just activated a chain of events that would leave her embarrassed at every HOA chapter she had ever joined. And as I closed the gate behind me, I allowed myself a moment of triumph, knowing that today I had defended my ranch, my legacy, and reminded everyone that some people are simply too bold for their own good. But the story had only begun, and what Karen didn't know was that her overreach was about to trigger a response she would never forget, and my fingers itched to start executing the plan that would remind every HOA member in the nation who truly held the power. The morning after Karen stormed off my property, the ranch hummed with its usual life, but beneath the ordinary sounds there was a current of electricity that I could not ignore. I spent the day walking each fence line, checking gates and old posts, while my mind rehearsed the moves I would make, because defending land was never only about law, it was about influence and about timing, and I had both in abundance. I called in a favor from an old friend who ran a small regional legal firm and asked for an informal review, nothing public, just an assessment of the HOA notice she had served and whether it had any weight against a property sitting outside municipal limits. He came out by noon with a battered leather briefcase and an expression that mixed curiosity and respect. As we walked the property together, he listened to my recounting without interruption, and when I handed him the clipboard, he frowned in a way that pleased me, because legal frowns were the first step toward victory. He confirmed my suspicion that the notice was legally meaningless and suggested a private letter to Karen outlining the lack of jurisdiction, with an offer to mediate rather than litigate. But mediation was not the point. I wanted to teach a lesson not only to Karen, but also to every petty tyrant who mistook a title for power. While the lawyer drafted a careful but firm response, I contacted my network silently and efficiently. The HOA ecosystem is smaller than most people think, and reputation travels faster than any notice. I had colleagues in other states and a few influential administrators who managed communications for multiple homeowner associations. I called them all and explained the situation without unnecessary drama. I wanted their assessment, and I wanted them to be ready for the fallout in the event Karen escalated. Her mistake was not her belief in the HOA system, but her failure to understand how those systems connected to each other. While the network warmed up, I prepared a different kind of weapon: information and optics. I invited a handful of neighbors to a small gathering under the pretense of a barbecued lunch, and while steaks sizzled and iced tea sweated in a cooler, I told a trimmed version of the morning's encounter, leaving out nothing that would appear petty, but highlighting behavior that crossed lines. I spoke about jurisdiction and about respect, and about how a simple misstep could have been solved with a phone call and an apology. I watched faces change from amusement to concern, because when someone tries to evict a neighbor unjustly, it reveals a threat to anyone who values autonomy. People began comparing notes about small grievances that had bubbled up over the years, and I could see the tiny embers of collective empathy catching fire. I wanted them aligned, not angry, and I wanted them informed, not vengeful. The lawyer's letter went out by certified mail with copies to the county clerk and a gentle note to Karen's HOA board indicating that any further action could be interpreted as harassment and might trigger a formal review of their internal procedures. I also placed a courtesy call to a journalist. I trusted a local reporter who cared about community stories and who understood how to write about power without sensationalism. I made it clear that I had no desire to create a spectacle, only to ensure that the public record would show a rational and measured response. If this woman decided to perform a public meltdown instead of accepting a clear boundary by late afternoon, I had a long list of small administrative moves that together would form a net around future abuse. First, I instructed our land manager to collect and catalog every piece of correspondence between the HOA and our property for the previous decade, because patterns matter and because when confronted with data, even the most determined bully hesitates. Second, I scheduled a routine review of my own HOA affiliations to ensure there were no conflicts of interest. I would not win by asserting power unfairly. I would win by demonstrating that my actions were measured and merited. Third, I drafted an outreach to the National Registry of HOA leaders, a neutral explanation of the incident framed as a cautionary tale about scope and authority. I wanted them to see how easily rules could be weaponized by someone who lacked context. Karen's blunder was a symptom of a culture that rewarded performative enforcement over thoughtful governance, and I plan to expose that culture slowly and systematically. Later that evening, Karen returned to the neighborhood. But this time, she came with reinforcements, a couple of local board members in tow, and a smug determination that made her look smaller than before. Her SUV rolled slowly past the ranch gate, and she peered in as if checking for signs of surrender. She did not approach me, but she wanted to be sure I saw her presence. I could have called her out from the porch and demanded she leave, but I chose instead to remain inside the house, where cameras recorded the exchange and where the optics favored patience, not provocation. She smiled at a neighbor who raised a hand in a civil but distant wave, and then she left without incident. The walk from her car to the corner shop later that night was the kind of stroll that feels like a performance. I watched from a second-story window as she talked on her phone, her gestures dramatic enough to suggest she was rehearsing some retort or escalation, but the calls did not appear to be winning her support. The people she reached were local and protective, but mostly uninterested in turning a small dispute into a headline. Having watched her for a few minutes, I realized she was improvising. She had no script for dealing with someone who refused to be intimidated, and improvisation leads to mistakes. The next morning, I received a curious email from one of the HOAs. Karen belonged to a polite inquiry about a complaint and whether the matter had been resolved. I replied succinctly that the complaint lacked standing and that I was willing to schedule a conversation to clarify jurisdiction and to encourage better communication. Overall, the reply came back with a tentative yes, and a request to avoid public escalation. I answered yes and suggested a mediator from the National Registry. Someone with no personal tie to either Karen or to me, someone neutral, would reduce the risk of petty theatrics, and it would give Karen an opportunity to save face while also giving me an official forum to explain boundaries. But while I preferred official channels to theatrics, I also understood that influence sometimes required a demonstration of capacity, not aggression. I therefore quietly arranged for a small audit of Karen's HOA leadership practices, nothing invasive, only a review of meeting minutes, voting records, and complaint procedures. I asked my contacts at other associations to be on the lookout for any sign of retaliatory behavior and to be prepared to intervene with reminders about best practices and ethics. The audit would not be public unless necessary, but its existence alone would encourage restraint and accountability. I also ensured that every official communication I made was archived and timestamped, because power is most effective when wielded transparently, and because a documented record disarms accusations of secrecy. By the close of Section 2, the stage was set. I had not burned bridges. I had not humiliated Karen in front of the neighborhood, though some would later describe it that way. I had created a corridor of oversight and a chain of accountability that would protect my property and my neighbors, while teaching a lesson about humility to anyone tempted to overreach. The ranch settled into a cautious calm, and the horses grazed as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. I had planted seeds of change, and those seeds would sprout in meetings and emails and in the careful rereading of bylaws. I could already imagine the future board discussions where Karen would have to explain her actions, and I could see the slow alignment of institutions that preferred order to spectacle and fairness to whim. There was still more to do, but the first moves had been made, and they had been made deliberately, with restrained intelligence and enough force to make Karen consider her next steps carefully. And I allowed myself to smile, because strategy executed well is a quiet joy, and because the ranch had always been worth protecting with more than just a shotgun and a stubborn heart. The next morning the ranch seemed calm, but I knew that calm was deceptive. It was the quiet before the next wave, and Karen's mind was already working feverishly. I began my day early as usual, walking along the creek that ran through the eastern edge of my property. The water sparkled in the sunrise and birds sang, but my thoughts were anything but serene. I drafted a detailed map of all HOA affiliations Karen had within my network. Each connection represented a potential lever, a subtle influence that could remind her that she was not the center of authority. I made notes on which HOAs had active dispute committees, which ones had strict bylaws, and which ones were more lenient with local interpretations. The goal was not chaos, but leverage and preparation. While the ranch staff handled routine maintenance, I began discreetly reaching out to select HOA board members across the states, I had cultivated long-standing professional relationships built on trust. In mutual respect, I sent them short updates about jurisdiction overreach and the importance of ensuring that minor misinterpretations of rules did not escalate into harassment issues. They responded politely acknowledging the concerns and in a few cases agreeing to monitor their own boards for any signs of Karen attempting to repeat her previous behavior. I could feel the tension building because Karen had unwittingly opened a Pandora's box. I also started preparing the next communication to her. HOA explaining that my legal counsel and I were available for consultation on governance practices and that our goal was to prevent any confusion in the future. This was phrased as helpful, not threatening, but anyone who knew me understood the subtle message behind the word accountability would be swift if boundaries were crossed again. Meanwhile, Karen attempted to regain composure in her own circles. She convened a small emergency meeting with her board members, discussing the previous incident. Her tone suggested frustration, but also panic. She tried to frame the interaction as a misunderstanding rather than a challenge to authority, but the more she spoke, the more it became apparent to me that she was improvising without a strategy. One decided to seize the moment by sending a carefully worded note directly to her, reiterating the need for clarity and offering an opportunity for mediated dialogue before escalating the matter publicly. I made sure to CC the regional HOA liaison and a few board members who were known for impartial judgment so that any attempt to twist the narrative would be impossible. The timing was critical because information flows slower than influence, and by placing the note in multiple hands simultaneously, I ensured that her story would be verifiable and neutralized any attempt at exaggeration. I spent the afternoon reviewing the ranch's property deeds and ensuring that all permits and documentation were up to date. I had already anticipated Karen's next move, which would likely involve attempting to question my ownership credentials or filing a baseless complaint about property use. By proactively assembling all records, I created a shield that would deflect any such attacks seamlessly. While the staff prepared the evening feed, I made a short visit to the horse paddocks, checking fences, gates, and water troughs. And during this time, I allowed myself a moment of reflection. The thrill of strategizing against Karen was tempered by the knowledge that power wielded responsibly was more effective than rash retaliation. I was teaching a lesson, but also preserving the integrity of my property and reputation. Later that day, I received a cautious response from one of the regional HOA supervisors expressing surprise at Karen's actions and requesting guidance on how to manage the situation diplomatically. I replied succinctly, advising them to ensure that any correspondence was factual, documented, and respectful, and suggesting a neutral mediator in case further disputes arose. The acknowledgement from a higher authority sent a ripple through the local network, reinforcing my position as someone who understood both law and governance. Karen did not notice immediately, but I could already sense that her confidence was eroding. She had counted on intimidation and public pressure to achieve compliance, and instead she faced organized patience, meticulous documentation, and subtle nationwide oversight. The most satisfying part of the day came during the late afternoon when I hosted a brief informal meeting with a few neighboring property owners. I shared insights on how HOA overreach can affect property rights and emphasized the importance of collective awareness and calm action. Without naming Karen explicitly, but recounting her actions in a factual and analytical way, I asked the neighbors directly, have you ever felt pressured by an HOA, and how did you handle it? Their faces revealed recognition and concern. Many shared minor grievances and anecdotes. The discussion remained respectful, but I could feel alignment forming, a network of cautious support that was ready to observe any future oversteps. By evening, Karen attempted another indirect maneuver, sending an email to one of her board members asking if I had responded to their previous complaints. I forwarded a copy to my lawyer and logged it in the official correspondence file, reinforcing the transparency of my actions and the visibility of her own maneuvers. While this may seem like bureaucracy, it was the battlefield. I chose each note, documented each step meticulously, and each interaction created a chain of accountability. I spent the night drafting a more detailed HOA briefing for a nationwide mailing emphasizing best practices for governance communication and the dangers of overreach. Without singling anyone out, it was academic in tone and practical in content, but the underlying message was unmistakable. Karen's approach was being quietly scrutinized across multiple jurisdictions, and the knowledge that her actions could be referenced in professional circles would keep her cautious for months or years to come. The ranch was peaceful under the moonlight, but I stayed awake a little longer, planning the next sequence of moves, carefully mapping HOA connections and visualizing how her next mistake could be handled in a way that reinforced my position while preserving dignity and order. By the end of Section 3, I knew Karen was beginning to understand that her aggressive attempt to assert authority had triggered a level of oversight she had never imagined, and that she would have to tread carefully in the future because the landscape had changed and I had set it in motion. The morning of the mediation arrived with a brittle kind of clarity. The sky was a clean blue that felt almost mocking given the storm we had quietly been stirring. I dressed plainly, no theatrics, nothing to feed rumor or inflame the cameras that a few neighbors had joked might show up. I wanted restraint to be the louder statement than any outrage could be. My mediator arrived on time, a composed woman named Elena, who had years of experience settling disputes without letting small tyrants turn minor friction into communal warfare. She carried a slim folder and an air of disciplined neutrality that was exactly what the situation required. As we sat across from each other in my sunlit kitchen, she introduced herself briefly and asked for a summary of the facts. I spoke slowly and clearly about the morning in which Karen had attempted to hand me an eviction notice and about the subsequent steps I had taken to document the incident and to protect my property. I avoided needless flourish. I described the law and the bylaws and the way jurisdiction worked and why the HOAS reach ended where my private ranch began. Elena took notes without expression and then turned to Karen, who had arrived flanked by 2 board members and who now looked smaller than the people she had brought to bolster her bravado. I watched Karen struggle to maintain composure. Her hands trembled slightly as she fiddled with the strap of her purse. She began with an apology that was half-hearted and then quickly shifted into a catalog of grievances about aesthetic standards, community cohesion, and alleged slights from my staff. It was the typical script of someone who had found herself unexpectedly on the defensive and desperately wanted to return to offense. Elena listened and then asked a question that ended up doing more to settle the room than any lecture about bylaws. Would you have come here first to speak to the rancher if you had concerns? Karen hesitated, then admitted she might not have. It was a small concession, but it was seismic in its implications because it revealed that insecurity and habit had driven her actions more than principle. That admission created space for a mediated solution, and I proposed a practical compromise and agreement to clarify jurisdiction boundaries, to institute a direct line of communication between the HOA and my land manager, and to set a protocol for future complaints that required confirmation of jurisdiction before any formal action could be taken. Elena approved of the proposal and asked Karen if she would sign on to the policy. Karen mumbled assent, but I could see resentment like a shadow at the edge of her face. It was not enough to simply set rules. I knew habits had to change, and that meant accountability without humiliation. So I suggested that the HOA undergo a short training on dispute resolution and respectful governance, and offered to fund the session if they would accept a neutral trainer selected by Elena. The offer caused a visible ripple across the small group and a murmur among the board that had come to support Karen. The choice to accept help is often more humbling than the help itself, but it had the power to turn the narrative from conflict to growth, and that was the narrative I preferred. Later that afternoon, Elena and I drafted a memorandum of understanding that captured the agreements we had discussed. The language was careful, clear, and intentionally simple, so it could not be misread or weaponized. The board members present signed the document, and Karen signed with a shaky hand, though her signature had a flourish that suggested she intended to recover the upper hand eventually. I did not gloat. I appreciated that restraint and that acceptance of process would do more to limit future abuse than any public shaming could have achieved. Yet the mediation was only one front in a larger campaign I had been running quietly behind the scenes, and part of that campaign involved cleaning house among the subtle networks Karen relied upon to justify her actions, I instructed my team to complete the audit we had initiated on her. HOA leadership practices Elena and I agreed that the audit should remain confidential unless it revealed systemic problems that required public correction. Within 3 days, the audit produced a pattern that was both unsurprising and disheartening. Numerous complaints have been filed anonymously and dismissed without transparent review. Minutes were missing from several meetings, and a few votes had been misrecorded in ways that favored certain board agendas. The findings did not prove malfeasance with forensic certainty, but they did suggest negligence and a willingness to prioritize image management over fair governance. I forwarded the audit to the Regional HOA Oversight Committee with a calm cover letter that asked for procedural recommendations and a plan to restore trust in local governance. The committee responded quickly, acknowledging the concerns and initiating a formal review process. Their language was bureaucratic and impersonal, and precisely what I had wanted, because it meant that the issue would be handled by institutions rather than turned into a spectacle. Karen learned of the audit through the proper channels, and her response was predictable fury, followed by frantic calls to allies who had begun to pull away once the reality of formal oversight set in. The allies had their reputations and their responsibilities to consider, and many chose distance over conflict. The social isolation was invisible but powerful, and I watched it unfold with a complicated mixture of satisfaction and remorse, because while I desired justice for my ranch, I had no pleasure in seeing someone's life unravel. I preferred correction to destruction, and I hoped the procedures in place would lead to reform rather than ruin. Meanwhile, the neighborhood began to change in small but meaningful ways. The neighbors who had once laughed nervously at petty enforcements now spoke with more confidence about their rights and about the importance of clear communication. I organized a community forum on governance best practices and invited Elena and 2 other neutral experts to speak. The turnout was larger than I expected, and during the forum, people asked practical questions about how to contest unfair fines, how to request records, and how to protect their properties from overreach. The most poignant moment came when an elderly woman from down the road stood and told a story about being frightened into compliance with a frivolous demand years ago because she did not know her rights. Her voice trembled, but it carried the truth of why I had pushed so hard to keep the ranch safe. It was never just about me. It was about creating a community where citizens felt empowered rather than intimidated. As the weeks passed, Karen oscillated between attempts to regain credibility and increasingly desperate measures to rally sympathetic ears, but the structures I had nudged into motion held firm. The regional committee recommended a series of corrective steps for her HOA, including the restoration of missing minutes, the institution of transparent voting practices, and an external review of complaint handling. The board agreed to implement these changes with reluctance, but agreement nonetheless. And when the first training session took place, Karen attended, but sat on the edge of the room, her posture rigid and her expression unreadable. She listened to the trainers as if the words were foreign in. At times she seemed to bristle, but slowly over time the people around her began to practice the new norms, and the small tyrant who had once wielded a clipboard like a cudgel found her voice softened by the force of accountability. The ranch returned to its rhythms. The horses grazed the creek, sang, the trees shaded the driveway. And while I continued to monitor communications and to maintain the chain of documentation, I felt a quiet satisfaction at having defended not only my land, but the principle that governance without humility is a danger to communities. The story was not yet finished. There were still loose ends to tie and reputations to repair, but by the end of Section 4 it was clear that a single overreaching action by someone who mistook title for authority had triggered a process that would teach a nationwide lesson. About the weeks following the mediation unfolded like a carefully orchestrated symphony, each note deliberate, each movement measured. I spent mornings walking the ranch, checking fences, gates, and pastures, but my mind was always working on the next step in the strategy. Karen's initial shock had worn off, and now she was attempting subtler forms of interference, small letters, questioning minor landscaping choices, emails asking for clarification on outdated bylaws, and casual conversations with neighbors intended to sow doubt. I cataloged each communication meticulously, noting the sender, the content, and the context, and forwarded copies to my legal counsel and select HOA contacts who had agreed to monitor her behavior. Quietly, I knew that influence was not about aggression. It was about visibility and consistency. By mid-morning, I began a series of discreet calls to HOA leaders across multiple states, friends and colleagues who understood the situation perfectly and were ready to intervene if Karen attempted to escalate anywhere else. I described the pattern of overreach and asked them to provide guidance to their boards on proper escalation protocols. Emphasizing jurisdiction and documentation, only a handful of these leaders had ever met Karen in person, but her reputation traveled faster than she could imagine. They nodded in agreement and promised to keep an eye out for any attempts at intimidation. The next task was public optics, but framed in a professional and educational context. I drafted a newsletter to multiple HOA chapters detailing best practices for communication, complaint resolution, and boundary enforcement, framed as a neutral guide, but including subtle lessons drawn from Karen's actions. I used hypothetical examples that mirrored her mistakes without naming her specifically and circulated the newsletter through Elena and other trusted mediators. By the time Karen read the newsletter, she realized the lesson was unmistakable and that her behavior was now being used as a case study in professional governance. She tried to respond by calling regional boards to contest the examples, but the framing was neutral. The documentation solid, and the professional tone prevented any dramatic retaliation. By the afternoon, I organized a small virtual seminar for neighboring property owners and HOA representatives. Elena co-hosted, explaining the legal limits of HOA authority and proper channels for resolving disputes. She highlighted the importance of jurisdiction and encouraged participants to ask questions. Karen, curious and desperate to regain influence, attended anonymously and could not remain silent for long. She asked pointed questions and attempted to interject examples that mirrored her prior actions. I allowed the discussion to continue, but every time she strayed from neutral factual commentary, I redirected the conversation to general principles or invited other participants to respond. Her attempts at dominance were carefully neutralized and documented, providing another layer of accountability. Later that evening, I walked the property again under the sunset golden light, reflecting off the barns and fences. I reviewed my notes from the day and planned the next moves. I instructed my team to begin a discreet historical review of HOA actions in our county, tracking repeated overreach by individuals and patterns that could inform future trainings. This was not a punitive exercise, it was strategic foresight. Every detail added a layer of protection for my property and for the community at large. By midweek, Karen attempted a more dramatic maneuver. She organized a neighborhood informal meeting at the community center, intending to rally sympathy by portraying herself as a victim of a single property owner's influence. I received a tip from an ally in her HOA and decided to attend quietly with Elena. As an observer, we arrived early and introduced ourselves to the community members, framing our presence as neutral guidance on governance questions. I spoke calmly about jurisdiction and the importance of evidence and documentation and the ethical responsibilities of HOA leaders. While leaving Karen to present her narrative, she stammered through her points, her earlier confidence eroded by the knowledge that every word she spoke would be witnessed by informed and neutral parties. Members of the community asked questions that highlighted inconsistencies in her story, and the professional context emphasized the need for fairness and transparency. By the end of the meeting, she left frustrated, the room buzzing with polite but firm discussions about property rights and accountability, and I realized that the invisible influence network I had been quietly activating across states was already reshaping perceptions. Karen's power relied on fear and assumption. She had relied on secrecy and surprise. I had countered with transparency, documentation, and education, every move reinforcing the principle that overreach has consequences. The night fell across the ranch, and the wind carried the scent of grass and earth. I reviewed the chain of correspondence I had created, the seminar notes and the documentation from the meeting, and smiled at the quiet victory, not in humiliation, but in systemic correction. Karen had begun to understand that her minor attempt at domination had triggered a web of accountability spanning states and boards, and that her every future move would be carefully observed and measured. I allowed myself a moment of satisfaction, walking along the creek thinking about how strategy applied with patience and intelligence could protect not only property, but community norms. By the end of Section 5, Karen's influence had been diminished not by confrontation, but by structure, by law, and by careful, patient orchestration, and I knew the final moves would solidify the lesson and ensure that her overreach would serve as an example for others for years to come. The final chapter of this saga unfolded with a quiet intensity, the kind that comes not from shouting, but from the slow tightening of consequences and clarity of authority. I began the morning by reviewing the comprehensive documentation we had assembled over the previous weeks, every email, letter, phone call, and meeting note cataloged and cross-referenced to ensure that every overreach Karen had attempted was recorded. Meticulously, I also reviewed the audit reports and seminar notes from neighboring HOA chapters and cross-checked them with communication from the Regional Oversight Committee, each piece a building block in the invisible architecture of accountability. I spent some time walking the ranch. As the sun rose over the pastures, the horses moved lazily, but my mind was alert, thinking about the final steps that would cement the lesson Karen had been gradually losing influence and confidence in the past weeks as her attempts to manipulate boards and neighbors were countered by transparency, neutral mediation, and professional documentation. Now, it was time to ensure that the lesson would resonate nationwide. I contacted the National Registry of HOA Leaders and drafted a concise report summarizing the incident, highlighting best practices, and outlining the procedures used to prevent escalation. While keeping the narrative neutral and professional, the report emphasized that overreach and intimidation were dangerous behaviors, and that documentation, accountability, and clear communication were essential. I sent copies to all affiliated HOAs, including those where Karen held any position. The response was immediate. Subtle but impactful. Leaders across states began checking their boards for similar vulnerabilities, and small seminars on jurisdiction and ethical governance were scheduled in multiple regions. By midday, Karen received formal notices from several boards requesting clarification on her actions and adherence to proper protocols. She was now dealing with multiple oversight channels simultaneously, and her options for improvisation were shrinking dramatically. I watched her frantic efforts to regain control from a distance, knowing that her power had been transformed from perceived authority to accountable responsibility. It was not humiliation that I sought, but a restoration of order and balance, so the community and the HOA networks could function fairly. Later that afternoon, I hosted a final forum at my ranch, inviting HOA leaders, neighbors, and regional oversight officials. We walked the property together and discussed clear boundaries, how jurisdiction works, and why minor overreaches can escalate in a nationwide scrutiny. I asked a simple question to the group, which everyone answered thoughtfully: have you ever witnessed someone overstep their authority, and what could have been done differently? And the discussion revealed collective wisdom and awareness. Karen attended reluctantly in the back, taking notes, but unable to dominate the conversation. Her influence now reduced to observation. She realized that the power she once assumed came from knowledge and procedure, not intimidation, and that every board she had controlled was now more aware and prepared for proper governance. The forum concluded with a statement from Elena emphasizing that accountability strengthens communities and that transparency protects both residents and leaders. The members applauded, and even Karen could not resist acknowledging the importance of clarity and proper procedure. By evening, I returned to the main ranch house and looked out over the fields. The sun dipped low, casting a golden glow across the property. The air smelled of grass and soil, and the quiet hum of life reminded me why I had fought not for pride, but for preservation and justice. I reviewed the last series of communications one final time, ensuring that every action taken was recorded and every lesson disseminated across networks nationwide. I reflected on the journey from a single audacious eviction attempt to a nationwide cascade of accountability and education. The process had been patient, methodical, and disciplined. Karen had learned the hard way that overreach has consequences and that authority without understanding is fragile. I felt a deep satisfaction, not in the humiliation of another, but in the establishment of a precedent that would protect communities across the country for years To come, the ranch returned to its rhythms, the horses grazed the fields, the barns stood firm, and the fences marked the boundaries clearly. But beyond the physical markers, a network of accountability, transparency, and respect had been solidified across multiple states, and boards. Karen's lesson would not be forgotten, and every HOA leader who followed would know that the chains of influence extend far beyond any single neighborhood, and that patient strategy and law can protect not only property but the integrity of governance itself. In the quiet of the night, I finally allowed myself to breathe deeply, knowing that the ranch was safe, the lesson delivered, and the ripple of justice spreading silently but powerfully across the nation.